And I want to welcome those of you who are joining us online as well. We're glad to have you too. I am super excited about tonight for many reasons. The main one is that my heart has been and will continue to be greatly shaped by each of the organizations that is sponsoring this event tonight. So this event is being put on by the Center for Christian Virtue, which is the local public policy organization here in Ohio that we're blessed to have and is run by a man who means a lot to me. Also, Tree of Life Christian Schools, which is run by someone who means a lot to my family, and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, which is also run by a guy who I guess is all right. But I'm really excited for this event. I'm going to go over sort of the way things are going to go tonight, and then I'm going to introduce someone who's going to come up and pray for us. But before we get into that, I just want to explain kind of our heart behind the event, what we wanted to do here today. Again, my name is Maria Bear, so I am a co-host of Breakpoint this week with John Stonestreet, who is the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I also have a daughter who goes to Tree of Life Christian Schools, and I have a husband who runs the Center for Christian Virtue. So my worlds are just totally colliding, but I'm really excited to be here with you guys tonight too. One of the things we wanted to talk about tonight is the way culture is speaking to our kids. That happens regardless of, what guardrails we put in place. It's happening all the time. It's important for us as parents and grandparents and friends and neighbors that we know what culture is saying to our kids and that we can speak life and truth into their lives as much as we can as well. I was thinking about this recently. Some of you might have heard me talk about this before. John and I have talked about this at length on the podcast, but we're big library people. So I have two daughters. My oldest is 6.5 and my youngest is 3.5. My oldest will be 6.5 on Saturday. I'm sure it would be very important to her that I include the half in her age, so 6.5 on Saturday. But we're big library people, and a couple years ago, we're getting ready to potty train my youngest, and I thought, I'll go to the library and find some books about how to use the potty, because libraries have books about those sorts of things, especially in the kids section. Most kids sections of libraries will have a board book section. These are books that are made out of cardboard because kids that are of the age that would read these books tend to chew on things. So they're not made of paper. That just reiterates the age group that we're talking about. So I'm going through this board book section trying to find a book about how to use the potty, and I can't find one because all I can find are books that are called A is for Activist and How to Be a Baby Feminist and Your Vote Matters, which is slightly concerning for a 2-year-old, and Baby Feminist and all these sorts of books, to the point where I had to go get a librarian to come and help me try and find a book about using the potty. And I went home thinking, something is backwards. Even if I felt that all of these topics covered by these books were like important and right topics, and that they were preaching the truth, which I don't. But even if I did, I would still walk away saying something is upside down. The ratio of books about voting compared to the ratio of books about like dinosaurs and princesses should be probably flipped from what it is right now. But that just illustrated to me again how culture is talking to our kids. This is a library section for 2-year-old kids. That's what my kids are facing. So imagine what kids are facing in school, in their friend groups, online. Kids are being shaped by the culture, and it is critically important that we know how, that we know what they're being told, and that when necessary, we know how to counter that. So that's one of the things we want to talk to tonight. We're obviously going to hear from two guys tonight in particular, and then we're going to have a panel discussion, but we're going to hear from men who have a lot of experience in the educational arena and in the Christian worldview arena about this issue. So first, I want to introduce Dr. Tad Mara. Dr. Mara is the superintendent of Tree of Life Christian Schools. He's also the executive pastor at Rock City Church. We're so blessed to have Dr. Mara with us. If I could just share one other really quick story about Tree of Life, where my oldest goes. This is the sort of thing that makes me so incredibly grateful that places like Tree of Life exist. And people like Dr. Mara. So a couple weeks ago, we have those little books, those little books for kids that are like Little Miss Happy and Little Mr. Grumpy and Little Miss Contrary. They're like egg-shaped people. I started reading to her one that's called Little Mr. Grumpy, and in the book, he encounters someone named Little Mr. Happy, and this person's going to teach Mr. Grumpy how to have a better demeanor, I guess. And I get into it, and my daughter says, who's in first grade at Tree of Life, said, Mom, joy is much better than happiness. So we should not call him Mr. Happy, we should call him Mr. Joyful. And at first I was like, excuse me, I'm telling this story, so let me read. But then I realized, I talked to her about it later, it was something she'd heard in chapel that week. And we read the Bible with our kids, we take our kids to church, we try and disciple them in the Lord, but she spends a lot of time at school. And the fact that there are people at school that also have her relationship with Jesus at the forefront of their minds is an incredible gift. Not every family can access that right now, but we're so grateful for it, and part of the reason that exists is because of Dr. Mara. So I'm going to let him take it away. He's going to pray for our evening tonight, and then we're going to move forward with Mr. Stonestreet.
Tree of Life is trying to help our students to train up their parents. That's part of our mission statement. Not true. Well, so thank you so much for joining us here tonight. You already know this. It's why you're here. It's why this is an important conversation. John's an incredible person to speak to. You'll be blessed by hearing from him tonight, no doubt. But our culture has lost its mind. It's lost its mind, and we're trying very hard to figure out how to walk forward without any foundation at all as a society, and we're all messed up. We get phone calls at Tree of Life nearly every day. Just, will you educate my kids in ways that are consistently biblical, because the culture's lost its mind. And so we're going to hear a lot about that. Let's get some wise counsel from John about how to walk forward as families, as grandparents, as community leaders. So let's welcome the Lord into that same conversation and hear from him. Lord, we'd like to hear from you above all else. So we're asking that the Holy Spirit in this place and in John speak to our spirit so that we could have a better equipping. Father, we're listening to you for a better equipping. We're concerned about what's happening in our culture. So will you help us understand? Will you help us know how to walk? Will you help us know how to love? Will you help us know how to raise children who will walk in you and with you and love like you? Lord, help us tonight. Help us tonight. In the powerful name of Jesus, amen.
Amen. Thanks, Todd. Okay, well, we're going to welcome up now Mr. John Stonestreet. He is the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, but most importantly, he is the co-host of the Breakpoint This Week podcast, which is hosted by me, Maria Bear. And I'm just really proud of him and just happy to have him here. Let's see, in your bio, John, it says, you are an author and speaker, true, on areas of faith and culture, theology, worldview, education, and apologetics. And I will add, the biggest scourge facing our nation today, which is the creation and sustaining of the TSA. So John, hopefully you can share a little bit with us tonight about the TSA. If you haven't heard him talk about it before, don't ask him about it. I'm just warning you right now. For those of you who don't know, the Colson Center for Christian Worldview was founded by the late Chuck Colson. John was lucky enough to learn under Chuck before taking over as the president of the Colson Center. We're basically a worldview outfit. We talk about theology, we talk about how the culture shapes us and how Christians can continue to shape our culture. So please welcome John Stonestreet.
Thanks, Maria. I've got to say, of all the introductions I've ever had, that one is by far the most recent, and I'm grateful for it. It's so rare that actually Maria and I are in the same room, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. But it is great to see you. Maria is a great part of our team, and we have a great time talking about some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, which aren't easy things to talk about. The reason I am invested in the conversation that we want to have tonight is not only because I believe in organizations like CCV, I believe in institutions of Christian education, especially those that are doing it really, really well, like Tree of Life Christian School. But because I'm not personally invested in Ohio, I am interested in this because this is a culture-wide issue that we have, or a set of issues really, that we've got to be able to unlock and understand and walk our way through. And for me it matters because I'm a dad. I have 4 kids. I have kids that range from a senior in high school to a kindergartner. In fact, my senior drove my kindergartner to his first day of school. Isn't that just really... I have 3 daughters, Abigail, Anna, and Allie, and they're 17, 15, and 13. And then we have an 8-year gap. And the reason we have an 8-year gap is because my daughters went on a 6-year prayer journey, and they committed to pray that God would give them a little brother. That was not the prayer that my wife and I shared with them, and God loves them better than us. And so we have a little boy named Hunter. So if you're keeping score at home, that's Abigail, Anna, Allie, A, and then Hunter, H, which is pretty much like our family kind of goes. So, but I care about these issues. And listen, the thing we need to understand is that this is a culture that in many ways disproportionately targets young people, children, with bad ideas. There's a saying that many of you have heard before. It doesn't originate with us. Richard Weaver wrote a book called Ideas Have. Anybody know how that finishes? Ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences. What we often talk about at the Colson Center is ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. And you also need to understand, too, that ideas have contexts. In certain contexts, in certain cultural moments, certain ideas are more impactful than in other times. And we live in a particular cultural moment in which certain ideas are having an incredible amount of influence, an incredible amount of sway. I mean, anybody else here dizzy by how quickly things went from being unthinkable to unquestionable, like overnight? Yeah, so that's kind of where we're at. And it's really important to understand what we mean when we talk about the culture losing its mind. Right? Because, I don't know that there is a word that is more used and less defined than the word culture. And a lot of times as Christians, because we're oftentimes known for just all the things we're mad at, then culture is used by us as a synonym for all the things that we don't like in the world. And I understand where that definition comes from, but we need to be a little bit more precise because the cultural challenges of this particular moment are different than the ones when we were growing up. And that includes whoever we is in this room. I look around and I see, old millennials and young Xers and old Xers and boomers and everybody in between. And just things, one of the features of living in the early 21st century is just how quickly culture can move, how quickly culture can change, and how quickly things can go from being unthinkable to unquestionable seemingly overnight. So we need to understand what are those ideas, what are those visions of life in the world that are so powerful and influential in this particular cultural moment. But we also need to understand, too, that we're living downstream from something that's been taking place now for decades. And a lot of the ideas that are so influential and powerful right now are kind of children themselves of ideas that started, 30, 40, 50, 70, 80 years ago, depending on if you want to, at what level do you want to start. And that is we are living downstream from probably the most successful cultural revolution that the world has ever seen. Several years ago, and it's funny, I was talking earlier with someone and thinking, 3 years ago usually means 5 because COVID, you just lose 2 years, right? So I'm pretty sure it was actually about 5 years ago. I was in Florida speaking to a group, and I asked, I know this is a risky thing to do, and I won't do it here, who's the oldest person in the room? There's a 97-year-old gentleman in the room. 97. And so we talked about it, and we thought about, how many different things, culturally speaking, that this man had seen over the course of his lifetime. Some of the most significant events in world history, incredible shifts in geography and nation states and all kinds of different things. And one of the features of the last 200 years has been revolutions, right? A lot of times they're political revolutions. But of all the revolutions that man had experienced or seen or lived during the course of those almost 10 decades, the most successful in terms of the one that has shifted our world top to bottom in such dramatic ways, and it's hard to imagine, particularly today, a single aspect of culture that has not been in some way shaped and influenced by this very successful cultural revolution. And that's why I call it the most successful social revolution that we've seen in our lifetime, and that's the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution is a vast and diverse set of ideas that has changed the world upside down. Now, if you hear that and you think of the sexual revolution purely in terms of morality, in other words, that certain sexual behaviors used to be off limits and now they're okay, and certain things that used to be considered good behavior is now considered bad behavior, and vice versa. Well, that's part of it, but that's a very, very small part of it. The moral changes of the sexual revolution, that's not the root of the issue at all. That's just the fruit. The root of the sexual revolution are not its ideas about right and wrong, but it's fundamentally its ideas about what it means to be human. It's ideas about who we are as human beings. What makes us who we are? What gives us our value? What is the meaning and purpose of life? And see, what's happened is that we live now downstream from the sexual revolution. And it would be a fascinating history to study if it had not been so dramatically consequential for people involved. Ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. The disproportionate victims of the sexual revolution have always been children. The disproportionate victims of the sexual revolution have always been children, from the very beginning to today. And we live now downstream from all the things that have been changed. And that's why we're seeing such a collision right now having to do with children. What are children's rights? What are parents' rights? What are best for kids? We don't even agree on what health care is or what health is for kids. You see what I mean? It's been a dramatic shift, and we have to understand it, I think, in order to understand what's going on. There's one more thing I was going to say. Hold on, it was going to change your life. Give me a second. I'll come back to it. I'm sure it'll hit me. Here it is. So, for example, when I say that the disproportionate victims of the sexual revolution have been kids, there's been a line, a promise that proponents of different stages of the sexual revolution have continued to kind of propagate and to repeat. And it's never been true, but we've said it over and over and over and over again, and that is, the kids will be fine. The kids will be fine. Right? How many different versions of that line have we heard over the last 6-7 decades? The kids will be fine, right? For example, some of you lived through the legalization of no-fault divorce, right? It's not really that old in terms of American culture. It only dates back to the 70s. And what was the promise? The version of the kids will be fine then was kids will be better with happy parents than married parents. Right? What kids need is for their parents to be happy, not for their parents to be married. Now that was said and that was repeated and that was claimed. So advocates of no-fault divorce laws really pushed that out and said the kids will be fine because they'll have happy parents. And that's what they really need, not married parents. And we said it over and over and over and over again as if it were true without any evidence or data to back it up. Well, now 20 and 30 years later, 40 years later, 50 years later, we have the data. In fact, a Jewish researcher named Judith Wallerstein from Harvard was commissioned by a foundation to study the impact of no-fault divorce on the children impacted by no-fault divorce. And she studied this over the course of 20 years before publishing the book, which was called The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce. And her conclusion was, guess what? The kids aren't fine. In fact, in most situations, kids don't need happy parents. What really does them good is if they have married parents. Now, that's not the case when it comes to abuse or some sort of danger. Don't hear me say that. In other words, there are exceptions to that rule. But in other words, that thing that we said over and over and over again, that the kids will be fine, the kids will be fine, the kids will be fine, turns out that they weren't. And then we can update that and talk about, well, you remember that remarkable moment? Some of you might remember this, that remarkably silly moment in American political history, and you're like, you have to be more specific. When Murphy Brown, do you guys remember Murphy Brown? And Dan Quayle got in a fight. Do you remember this? A real-life presidential candidate and somebody who doesn't actually exist got in a fight. It was bizarre, right? And that was, of course, over intentionally single parenting, right? The New York Times Magazine 20 years after that one, that whole scenario happened. And if you don't know that story, basically there was this kind of storyline as part of the show of Murphy Brown of a career woman, single, wanting to have it all, intentionally having a child as a single mom. And Dan Quayle on the campaign trail said something about it. He got absolutely excoriated, and the media just really attacked him on it, and it probably cost him the election, actually. Either that or he didn't know how to spell potato, but one of those two things. But what happened was, 20 years after that, the headline of the New York Times Magazine was, the New York Magazine said, turns out Dan Quayle was right. It's fascinating. Again, it was another way of saying, no, the kids will be fine. The kids will be fine. Kids don't need two parents. They don't need a mom and a dad. They just need a loving parent. And of course, we're still having versions of that conversation today. Now, my point is that every stage of the sexual revolution, no matter if we're talking about the early days ideologically, or we're talking about the early days culturally, or where we're at now kind of downstream from all that, the disproportionate victims of the sexual revolution have been kids. So if we really want to understand what this is saying, kids and culture, the clash for the next generation's hearts and minds, we can talk about a lot of stuff, but if we really want to get to the heart of it, we got to get to the heart of how the sexual revolution has created a cultural moment that is so challenging for children. And I want to walk through that by framing it in terms of three stories. These are three very recent stories, three stories that I have come across over the last, let me do the math here really quickly, less than a year, probably 6 or 7 months. But to me, these three stories kind of frame out some of the real challenges that kids face. And then I'll do that, and then we can have a conversation with you guys, and I think with Aaron, and that's the plan, right? Is that the plan? Okay. All right, so here's the first story. The first story is actually about a colleague of mine who lived in Colorado Springs. Her and her husband and children were at a charter school there in Colorado Springs, and then they moved away to a different state. I won't tell you which state it was, but it was Minnesota. And then they came, this actually isn't about Minnesota, it's about Colorado Springs. They came back to Colorado Springs and wanted to re-enroll their children in the same charter school. Now, what had happened in the 3 or 4 years that they had been in Minnesota had been a lot of the things that we had seen, a lot of the things that many people woke up and realized, particularly, for example, if you lived in Loudoun County, Virginia, that something was happening in the schools with the school boards. We're having conversations, and people were concerned. Well, in this particular case, it had to do with the gender conversation. And so my colleague sat down with the principal, and as they were seeking to re-enroll their children back into the same charter school, and said, how do you guys handle the gender conversation? And his line was, it's not something we talk about. This is something that actually is the parent's job to determine what's right and what you want to teach your kids. We won't address the idea of gender identity in our classes. Now, you think the conversation's over, but my colleague was really wise. And instead of letting that go, she said something else. She said, well, what happens if there is a student who identifies as a gender that isn't in alignment with their biological sex, and they demand my child use those pronouns? And the principal said, well, then they'd have to use the pronouns. So, well, what if they didn't think that they could because of their beliefs? He said, well, then we'd have a disciplinary conversation with me. Now, isn't that an interesting situation? In other words, what it tells us is, in many ways, is when it comes to the gender ideology issue that is very prevalent in so many places, that one of the approaches that's largely been taken, including by this particular charter school, in which it wasn't an issue just 4 years ago, is we're not going to have the conversation, but we are going to assume the conclusion. Does that make sense? We're not going to have the conversation anymore. We're not going to have a conversation about what's right and what we should believe and what we shouldn't believe, but we're going to assume what the conclusion is. And if you don't assume the same conclusion, then you can't be a part of this particular community, or you face disciplinary action as a student. C.S. Lewis once said that the most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones that are argued, but the ones that are assumed. And one of the things we need to know when it comes to our students in this particular cultural moment and children in this cultural moment is that in many of corners of our culture, especially in the educational arena, there are very significant ideas that are no longer being argued. They're no longer up for debate. They're just being widely assumed. Here's what the conclusion is. And the most significant area in my mind in which ideas are being widely assumed that have such deep consequential, that are so deeply consequential, let's just put it that way, is in the realm of identity. What does it mean to be human? And in particular, what does it mean to be human in relation to what I feel on the inside and who my body says that I am on the outside? And how do we actually balance that? And it's a really strange moment we live in, because in some corners, certain parts of our physical bodies, for example, our ethnicity, the color of our skin, is assumed to be the defining aspect of who we are, the most defining aspect of who we are, one that actually determines almost everything about us. But when it comes to our chromosomes and our hormones and the parts of our bodies that represent whether we are male or female, then that in and of itself is up for grabs. Isn't that a strange irony in which we live? You guys remember there was a story out of North Carolina a couple years ago having to do with bathrooms. Does that ring a bell? Remember the whole bathroom conversation in North Carolina? What a mess that was. In the public hearings about that, a child psychologist from Duke University testifying in that whole lawmaking process in the court case there in which I think it was the city of Charlotte sued the state or something like that. Here's what this child psychologist from Duke University said, that when it comes to determining sex and gender, let me see if I can paraphrase this right. Let me put it this way. She goes, when it comes to who we are, our chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, and external genitalia are not scientifically reliable means to determine sex and gender. She wasn't talking emotionally. She wasn't talking about how you feel. She actually said chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia are not scientific ways to determine sex and gender. It's a remarkable thing, isn't it? What does that mean about our bodies? One of the things that's widely assumed is that the body itself is just part of reality that is completely up for grabs according to the human will. Let me say that again. The thing that's being assumed, we could talk about assumptions that are being made about gender, assumptions that are being made about race and ethnicity, assumptions that are being made about class and all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, the underlying confusion is that the human body itself has been made something that is completely pliable and moldable according to our internal desires, according to how we think we want to be, how we feel we want to be. Carl Truman, who's a professor at Grove City College, has written a book that's really helpful. It's really dense, and thankfully he wrote it kind of an academic version and a not-so-academic version. The academic version is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And in it, he identifies that in this late stage of the sexual revolution, the thing that we're really wrestling with as a culture is what he calls expressive individualism. Expressive individualism is this idea that who we are is whatever we express ourselves to be. So the number one job we all have as humans is not to recognize what is real. It's not to adjust our lives to what are any givens in the universe, but it is to express whoever we want to be. And the number two job that all of us have is to accept everyone else's expression of whoever they want to be. Now, do you understand what this means? In other words, who we are at our most fundamental level is assumed to be completely disconnected from anything fixed, anything given, anything solid, anything standard. In other words, we are now trying to do life in the world. Not just personal moral decision making, but all of life in the world, culturally, relationally, family, at the level of the state, top to bottom. as if there is no fixed reference point by which to orient it all. It's kind of like what we're trying to do as a culture is have everyone find their way out of the wilderness of confusion, giving them a compass that always points at them. Why does a compass work? Why does a compass work? It always points north. Now, this is important because some of you are thinking because it tells you which way to go. No, it doesn't. If you just always follow wherever the arrow goes, it could be wrong. You would just be getting colder and colder and colder. In other words, it always points where? North. Why? Because it points to something fixed and unchanging that's outside of you. Does that make sense? But imagine that you're trying to find your way out of the jungles of Columbus, and we give you a compass, and everywhere you turn around, that compass is pointing at you. Right? No matter where you go, you're the North Pole. If you're the North Pole, you're going to be always lost. Right? In other words, there has to be something fixed by which to orient our sense of identity, our sense of meaning, our understanding of truth, and even things like beauty and justice and all the other big eternal concepts that we have to wrestle with because we're human beings. But what we have now is a culture that's untethered itself from anything fixed and unchanging, and so therefore it's completely up for grabs, even the most observable realities. It's an amazing time to be a Christian, by the way, if you're a follower of Christ, because we have entered a new era of apologetics, of what it means to present a compelling gospel to the world. You know, the whole 20th century was basically, in a sense, Christianity fighting against becoming scientifically disproven. So we would talk about how we know miracles can happen, and we were accused of being so esoteric and feeling-centric and other-worldly minded. You remember that old saying, you Christians are so heavenly minded, you're no what? Earthly good. That was the whole 20th century. Now we're at the beginning of the 21st century, and we're the ones going, hey, you have a body, you have parts, and they matter. Christianity right now has a task of being a profound testament and witness to the reality of creation. That there is a God, not only that there is a God who created the world, but there's a world that was created by God. And that includes our bodies. That's the first story. Here's the second story. The second story has to do with a conversation that I had back in June with a friend of mine who is a resident of a city in the Northeast that I will leave unnamed, but it was Boston. And this woman is a wonderful theologian in the Roman Catholic Church. She's a brilliant lady, and she was telling me, as we were having this conversation, about a friend of hers who teaches in the public school system there in Boston. And she teaches junior high. So my friend asked her friend and said, well, how many students in your junior high class identify as LGBTQ? The response was not just a response. You have to understand, it came with a tone of voice. Do you know what I mean? Like you should have already known this, and why would you be asking such a silly, obvious question tone of voice? You see what I'm saying? So let me kind of role play here. How many kids in your class identify as LGBTQ? And the response was, oh, all of them do. Well, she said, what do you mean all of them do? Like every one? She said, oh yeah, every one of them does. She's like, how can they all identify as LGBTQ? Are they having sex? No. Most of them, no. Maybe one or two of them are having sex, but no, they're not having sex. Well, if they're not having sex, why are they identifying as LGBTQ? And her answer was, oh, because none of them want to be straight. Fast forward 6 weeks later, I'm in Kentucky. Kentucky is not in Boston. All right, I just wanted you to get Kentucky's not that far from here. Let's just put it that way. And I learned of another friend of a friend. This friend of a friend is a youth pastor at a pretty conservative denomination church, but a large church outside of one of the bigger cities in Kentucky, which, as we all know, is not saying much. I'm not saying that to be offensive. It was Lexington. It's a great city. It's just not that big. Fair enough? This youth pastor told my friend that all the boys in the junior high class that he leads identifies as bi. Bi. He's like, are they having sex? No, they're not having sex. Well, why would they identify as bi? And the answer was the same. Because none of them want to be straight. You have to understand that a lot of times ideas are complicated by other ideas. And we've got two ideas colliding right now that are creating some really challenging things for our students. And if we're going to teach them to love God's creation and to believe God when God looked at all that he had made and he said, behold, it is good, then we're going to have to reckon with two things. Not only this really bad idea that we're untethered from our bodies, and the only thing that's true about us is whatever we impose in terms of our inner self on the outer world, but there's also something that I'll call, and what we've called around the Colson Center at work here, called a critical theory mood. Now, when you hear the word critical theory, because of the conversations we've had in America for the last little bit, you're probably thinking critical race theory. That's not what I'm talking about. Critical race theory can be a form of critical theory, but the problem with critical race theory right now is that anytime some people, the conversation of race comes up, they just think that somebody's being a critical race. That's not true. We have to have hard conversations about race in America. It still do. It's absolutely true. We got to have them. The problem is that the critical theory mood that's framing that conversation is framing all kinds of other conversations. And critical theory is this academic theory, really has its roots in legal theory, although it comes out of the postmodernist family, that basically says that this culture is everything about us. So we belong to particular groups of people. And particular groups of people should be placed in one of two categories, either an oppressor category or an oppressed category. And be based on which category you're placed in, not only are you either an oppressor or an oppressed, but also you have a degree of moral guilt or you have a degree of moral superiority, not based on who you are, not based on how you've behaved, not based on what you believe, not based on what you've done or how you've treated anybody else, but simply because of the group of person that you belong to. Does that make sense? I'll put this a different way. The problem with CRT is not the fact that the conversation talks about the R. The problem with CRT is that the CT framing of the R conversation completely takes it out of any constructive place to go. And by the way, CRT was so 2020, the conversation today is critical queer theory. And it's been such an effective cultural narrative that all the junior hires are ahead of us. When my friend asked her friend, why do they all identify as LGBTQ? Do you remember what the answer was? Because none of them want to be straight, or none of them want to be cis. Do you know what the word cis is? Do you know what that refers to? Who here knows? Who here doesn't know? Who's tired? Okay, I was just wondering. Cis is short for cisgender. Cisgender is the newest made-up word that we have. No, it is. It's a word that probably doesn't need to exist, but it is a word that refers, and this is a formal definition, and you can hear, I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, if words aren't worth fighting for, what on earth would be? This is an example. Think about everything that's kind of backloaded into this word cisgender. Cisgender is a word that means, that refers to those who continue to identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Let me say it again. Cisgender means those who continue to identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Now, what are some of the ideas that are being smuggled into that or assumed by that definition? Continue to, yeah. And that who they are is something that they've identified as, not something that they've recognized. What else? Assigned. Not just gender that was assigned, but what? Sex. You see, it used to be that we separated sex from gender. Sex was the hardware, gender was the software. Sex was the body parts, gender was however we express ourselves. Now the idea is that even sex is assigned, not reflective of reality. Does that make sense? So cisgender essentially refers to people who are people who continue to identify as male and female in agreement with what the doctor first said. Fair enough? Okay. In other words, that refers to almost everyone who's ever lived. With exceptions, but very rare exceptions overall. Why do you have to have a word for the vast majority of people and not just the exceptions? Do you understand the question? Why does there need to be a word for both? Sorry? Yeah, so in other words, it allows you to marginalize it. Otherwise, you're saying normal and abnormal, and that's not okay. Do you see what I'm saying? So they both become categories of equal moral weight. But the problem is the CT conversation has now affected the cultural imagination. Most people have never read a critical theorist. But see, ideas don't just come to us in books, they come to us in cultural moods. I'll give you an example. 25 years ago, when I first started talking about worldviews and comparing different worldviews, one of the worldviews we started to talk a lot about at the time was Post-Modernism. Post-Modernism is the intellectual heritage of a group of French philosophers, guys like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Jean-Francois Lyotard, things like that. Really unfortunate name, by the way. And you would talk about, this worldview of postmodernism, which is reality is a social construct. There's no givens in life. Truth is whatever we say it is. Reality is whatever we say that it is, and we say that it is because our own way of thinking is socially constructed. And people would say, no, postmodernism is not really a big deal because no one's ever read Derrida, and no one's ever really read Foucault. And they're right. No one really had read Derrida because it was impossible to understand him. And, Foucault had his own issues and so on. But we didn't need to read them. You know why? Because we had Kurt Cobain and Britney Spears. Does that make sense? In other words, we lived in a postmodern moment in the 90s. How many of you guys remember the 90s? Let me start. How many of you guys remember pop culture in the 90s? Okay, so you remember there was a real postmodern moment that shaped the way that we think. We don't have we don't have a world in which most people have really engaged the critical theorists. We do have a world, however, in which there's a critical theory mood, where we don't just divide people up into categories based on random characteristics, or not random characteristic, but groupings of people. But we also assign those groupings of people moral status. And if you say this is all new to you, it is. But for the junior hires in Boston and apparently outside of Lexington, Kentucky, they've caught that mood. There are good guys and bad guys. And guess who the good guys are? And you go back to the remarkable words of Martin Luther King Jr., in which he said that he dreamed of that day when we would not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. What critical theory does on the racial question is that it does the exact opposite. It assigns guilt it assumes the content of character by the color of skin. But critical theory itself is doing that based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and all kinds of other groupings, immigration status. I mean, you can just kind of go down the line. People are grouped up based on who they belong to, and then moral status is assigned. And if you don't think that that's a compelling belief to you, it is the water that our kids swim in right now. Does that make sense? Okay. How are we doing on time? We doing good? Okay. Should I ask them that, not just you? Okay. All right, let me give you the third story. The third story is one that I just heard a few weeks ago, and it almost broke my heart. You might realize if you follow Breakpoint, or, of course, Breakpoint this week with Maria Bear, with an occasional word in by John Stonestreet. I'm kidding. Then, we talk about a lot of stories. We talk a lot of stories. So when you deal with so many stories in culture like we do, and we try to help Christians make sense of these cultural stories, then it is it's rare that you come across a story that really just knocks you on your back. I was privileged to host an event, which you can still find online, by the way, with our friends at the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Heritage Foundation and a number of other people. It was an event called Promise to America's Parents. And the Promise to America's Parents was trying to address something that this story reveals. And I just didn't realize quite to the extent in which it had gotten. It's the story of Abigail Martinez, who immigrated from Mexico with her family. Her daughter grew up, was always very princessy, always loved the Disney princess stories, very frilly, loved to spin around, that sort of thing. This is how she told the story that day at this event that I hosted or emceed. And when she hit junior high, she started to struggle. Anybody here have a daughter that hit junior high and started to struggle with who they are? And yeah, I mean, it's kind of part of the gig, right? And guys do it too, but girls have unique challenges, I think. They tend to. And Abigail's daughter was no different. What had happened, though, she was in a school district in California that had already decided certain things about mental health challenges and struggles. And so when she sought help for her daughter, go talk to the school counselor, her daughter did. And at that point, the counselor stepped in between Abigail's daughter and Abigail and started to convince Abigail's daughter that really the issue that was at root behind her depression, something that according to Abigail she had never seen in her daughter before, was the fact that she had been born into the wrong body and that she really was a boy and that she would be happier and at peace if she identified as a boy. Abigail's daughter started to believe this and would go to school and present herself as a boy, chose a boy's name, and kept it from Abigail for a long time, until the point came when Abigail figured out what was happening, that essentially the school counselor, without the knowledge of Abigail, without her permission certainly, was leading Abigail's daughter down the path of what's called a social transition. The social transition is a first step that leads then to chemical intervention and then long-term surgical or permanent surgical options. And so Abigail's daughter, when Abigail found out about it, was already calling herself by a new name, of course, hairstyle and then also dress, and then all of a sudden Abigail realized what was happening and went to the school counselor to try to get some answers. The school counselor basically said that you need to be on board with this, because if you aren't on board with this, then you will be responsible for your daughter's death. You will be responsible for her taking her own life. It reached the point, because Abigail decided not to affirm the counselor's opinion and not to affirm her daughter's struggles, that the school then even went so far as to report Abigail to Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services came in and in an emergency sort of decision, because Abigail's daughter, even though she was following the treatment path, so-called treatment path of the school, so that she wouldn't kill herself, had become suicidal. So Abigail's daughter went to a resident home where she lived out the rest of her high school years there. And Abigail's mom was allowed to go see, Abigail was allowed to go see her daughter an hour a week, and was told by the center there that she was not allowed to talk about her faith, because that wasn't affirming, and she wasn't allowed to talk about anything that wasn't affirming of her daughter's new gender transition. A year or two after high school, after continuing down that path, Abigail's daughter committed suicide. Abigail was told that she would be the cause of her daughter's suicide if she prevented her daughter from going through all of these so-called treatments. In reality, the treatments did not actually take her any further towards peace, but actually led her further into a sense of dysphoria from who she was, and she ended up taking her own life. I heard that story and I was just blown away, because it's one thing for these ideas to be out there. It's another thing for these ideas to be weaponized by the state to step in between the relationship between a parent and a child. That may not be the case in Ohio right now. It is the case in certain parts of the country. Right now, for example, I was in Michigan last week. They're wrestling with something on the ballot here at the election called Prop 3. Have you heard about it? Do you guys know what's happening in Michigan, the Prop 3? It has to do with 20 or so odd pro-life laws that are on the books, having predated Roe v. Wade. Well, Roe v. Wade gets overturns all of those, or puts a stop to all of those 20-some pro-life laws, and now then these 20-some laws should be back in effect, but they were put on stay by the court and so on. And so Prop 3 is a radical pro-abortion law that would enshrine abortion rights into the state constitution at the constitutional level for the state of Michigan. But not only that, it's done in the language of reproductive rights with no age limitations and no ability for any people of authority to interfere with reproductive decisions. So one could quickly see if a girl is pregnant, then the parent cannot interfere. But also, because of that category of reproductive rights, one could see that if a child wanted to transition from a boy to a girl, then also the parent could not interfere there too. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, one of the features of Abigail's story which made me realize that the ideas about identity and the ideas about the critical theory mood that's shaping how this conversation is happening in our culture, that there now is a level of state enforcement that is really should be concerning. And there's going to be, I think, a calling for parents right now, as much as possible, to not sit this one out. When I heard Abigail's story, at that point, my mind was reeling how we could reach a point in the United States where the state could step into a parent's role. But then Abigail was asked one more question. And this is what sent me over the edge to a new level of dismay. She was asked, how did your church respond when you were going through this challenge? And Abigail said that when she would go see her daughter for that 1 hour a week of prescribed visitation, her daughter would ask her, does such and such know that I'm here? Is he coming to visit me? She was asking about her youth pastor, because her youth pastor she felt that she was really connected to. And she wanted her youth pastor to know that she was there. And she wanted her youth pastor to come see her and to pray with her and to talk with her. This was the daughter. And so every week, according to Abigail, Abigail's daughter would ask her, does he know that I'm here? Is he coming to see me this week? The youth pastor never once came. The pastor never once reached out to Abigail. My emotions then became something different. It wasn't anymore that it wasn't just that I was kind of perplexed and how do we reach this state as a nation. Suddenly it became a level of anger that I just really wasn't comfortable with because I had to get up right after the story and MC it. And I'm just like, how on earth? No one should ever have to go through what that mom went through. Fair enough? And good heavens, no one should ever have to go through it alone. N.T. Wright once said that Christians don't always get to choose what they care about, because we live in a cultural moment where certain things are critical issues, maybe that weren't for other generations. We are living in one of those times. In particular, if we live in a cultural moment in which the state is stepping in between parents and children, one of the things that these parents need are churches who will step up and walk alongside with them. Does that make sense? We cannot allow each other to go through this alone. We need to be together. That's why there's going to be such an increased significance to Christian schools like Tree of Life. I don't know if you've heard about this, but all across America, non-state-sponsored educational institutions are full and overflowing. That includes Christian schools. This is the greatest opportunity for Christian education in our lifetime to make an incredible dent. Let's lean in and support them. Right now, we know, particularly after the Dobbs decision, that a lot of the political things that used to be the purview of the U.S. Supreme Court or the White House or the U.S. Congress has moved to the state level. That's why groups like CCV are so absolutely critical, right? And we all, if we're going to stand beside each other, we need to know what it is that we believe. We need to know why it is that we believe what we believe. And we need to be able to stand with each other in a way that can speak truth, that can love, that can support, and can help each other. Does that make sense? In other words, right now is a moment for Christians to lean into cultural engagement. And that means every Christian. Don't think you should outsource this job, to Aaron or to, Jim Dobson or somebody like that. Like, it is all of our jobs to wrestle and help each other through this particular cultural moment, particularly because it's the children who are those disproportionate victims. Does that make sense? All right. Want to have a conversation? Is that good? All right.
Hey, thank John.
Something I wanted. Thanks, bud.
Thanks, John. Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of a panel discussion now. The way this is going to work is I have a couple questions of my own that we're going to start with, but I want to invite all of you guys as well. If you have questions for anybody up here, whether it's Aaron or Todd or John, come up in here and have a seat right in this front row right here. If you can see, this microphone is right here off to my side, and when you come in and sit up here, that'll alert me that you have a question, and then when we have a break in the conversation, I'll throw it over to you. So just one note on the questions. As Aaron always says at his events, sometimes they have questions as well. If you can't get your question out in one breath, that's not a question, that's probably a statement or a sermon. Try to get your question out in one breath. That way we can get all the questions in that we can and move things along. So before we do that, though, I have a couple questions of my own. So I actually want to start with you, Todd. I was thinking about this, listening to John, and just thinking through what is hitting our kids. I mean, I shared that story about the library earlier. And that's annoying to me, and it is problematic, but it's also relatively low stakes when you think about what school kids are facing and kids are facing as they get older. So I know that Tree of Life is experiencing what John mentioned about, just an explosion in families that are looking for educational alternatives. And I also know, just from talking with you and teachers at the school as well, that it's not just Christian families that are reaching out to Tree and looking for an alternative. So can you share with us, what are you hearing from parents and families that are calling Tree and looking for something else? What are they worried about? And what are they looking for as an alternative?
It's a great question. We literally get the call almost every day, hey, are you going to hold to some kind of biblical standard? And sometimes it's as simple as, do you still have male and female bathrooms at your school? Like, there are questions like that and phone calls coming pretty regularly. I will say we just got an invitation this week, Aaron, to the National Association for Early Childhood Conference. And it's all for early childhood kids, and it's a secular organization. And almost all of the topics at the conference, almost all the speakers had something to do with affirming your child's gender fluidity. Like, we couldn't believe it. We're talking about 3-year-old kids being taught by their teachers to affirm their gender fluidity, and we all looked at each other and said, we've lost our minds. But parents are getting wind of the same kinds of questions, as saying, this isn't aligned with how I want to raise my children. And that's why we see them in going to the school board meetings, etc. But they're really looking for a partner who will say, and the way we say to Tree of Life is, we're trying to do 3 things with kids. We're trying to train their heads to think biblically, to think God's thoughts after him. The culture is doing the opposite. We're trying to train their hearts to love passionately like Jesus does. And we're trying to train their hands to serve generously. So for us, it's almost as simple as head, heart, and hands. And there are many, many families looking for that for their kids because the culture is doing the opposite.
Awesome. Thanks, Todd. Well, I'm going to ask Aaron a question. Aaron, I haven't introduced you yet. Is it Bear, I want to say? Aaron
That's
Bear?
close enough.
Okay. Aaron, in addition to being my husband, is the president for Center for Christian Virtue. So this is a Christian public policy organization that advocates in Ohio in particular for legislation that reflects the truth of the gospel. That's the mission statement, right? So I want to ask you, John mentioned some of the issues that are happening. He shared Abigail's story, which is heartbreaking every time you hear it. Are you familiar with anything similar happening in Ohio? And what can and should we do about it?
Yeah, I think the reality of the situation we're living in America is that the situation that John described, maybe the specific details are unique, but the concept is, I think that the best term I could use for it would be the standard of care across the board in schools and in medicine today. This gender ideology is not the exception. It is the rule of how things are being approached generally in the public education system across all of Ohio, and in the medical system across all of Ohio. And I want that to be shocking to you because it is incredibly radical. And it is also the reality of the state, the city we're in right now, the county we're in right now, and the state we're in right now. So a few different things to paint this picture for you. Let's first start with the educational aspect of this. Just 2 weeks ago, a guy named Christopher Rufo published a story, an investigation on his website out of Hilliard City Schools, a suburb just to the west here. A lot of kids at Tree come from Hilliard. I'm sure there's some folks in here from Hilliard. Hilliard City Schools, sort of standard suburb in Ohio. And what it featured was that there were teachers wearing these name badges that said, from the National Education Association, the largest teachers union in the state, that had a QR code for kids to scan that said this teacher was an ally, right? And it said, if you want resources, here is about how to be supported, here's a link for you to go to. When you scan that QR code, it took you to a resource called Sex Acts That Don't Get Enough Play. And it taught children about fisting and anal sex and oral sex. And this was for their middle school and high school teachers to be wearing on the first day of school. And this was standard. This story was exposed. It was on Fox News. And the teachers still have the name badges today. They're just told to cover the QR codes. Up here in Olentangy City Schools, we have parents came to us and said, my kids came in from field day this past spring, and my daughters went in to get changed afterwards because they were soaking wet from a balloon fight, and there was a boy changing in the bathrooms. And we went to the principal and said, hey, this isn't right. And they said, sorry, this is our school policy. I see my friend Bryce Curfee's here, who's been involved in the city of Upper Arlington. When the kids came back from COVID closures, they found that all of the bathrooms in UA schools, in the high school, were changed to unisex bathrooms, so boys and girls were using the bathroom together. This ideology has permeated, and the policies of this have permeated public schools. Just 2 weeks ago, and actually tomorrow there's going to be another state school board meeting on this. 2 weeks ago, the Ohio State School Board had a meeting on a policy where the state school board wanted to pass a resolution to say that we shouldn't require that boys be allowed to participate in girls' sports and boys be in girls' bathrooms, private spaces, those types of things. The hearing was packed with teacher unions members, teachers, counselors, other public school administrators saying, we can't pass this resolution because we have to be able to continue our policies of not telling parents what we're communicating with their kids. These are their policies in every public school in Ohio. So that's the educational system. This is why we say, get your kids over to Tree or any of the other great Christian schools we have in the state, or homeschool. That's the educational system. The medical system, right now, every major medical system in the state of Ohio, Nationwide Children's, Cleveland Clinic, Akron General, Cincinnati Children's Hospital, Dayton Children's Hospital up in Toledo, has a gender clinic. And the standard of care for children is to find out their gender identity and treat them as such, how they personally identify. We have the training materials from Nationwide Children's Hospital where they are training doctors to do everything they can if the child does not think their parent would be accepting of their gender identity to keep it from the parents. We had a situation in Cincinnati in 2019 where a child was removed from parents' custody by Hamilton County Court because the parents would not consent to hormone therapy. This was 2019. This is the world we're living. This is why at CCV we're running the SAFE Act, the Saving Children from Experimentation Act. Because what's happening in our state right now, it's House Bill 454. It would ban these surgeries and hormone therapies on kids. We know these hormone therapies and surgeries are happening in the state of Ohio. We know that at Nationwide Children's Hospital, they see this as central. Their On Our Sleeves campaign, their mental health campaign that you're seeing advertised all over the place, focuses on LGBT mental health. This is what they see as central to their mission. And there's times where you stand up and you start pointing these things out where it sounds like you have a tinfoil hat on, but when you actually see what's happening, it's devastating. And the consequences are awful. And the only place right now that can stop it is the State House and Governor DeWine by signing the SAFE Act.
I saw a school, I believe it was a union member, a teachers union member, talking about, this was online on social media, talking about the importance of not dead naming kids. So are you guys familiar with this concept of dead naming? So when a child says that they're transgender and they choose to use a different name, dead naming is when you use the original name. And this teacher was talking about, I don't care what parents say, I don't care what the state says, the very least you can do to be a kind teacher and a good person is to not dead name a kid. And John, I thought about this when you brought up Chesterton, I think it was, quote about if words aren't fighting for what are, because my response to if you can't fight for a name is a word. Each one of you all gave your kids their names. I gave my kid their name. Nobody gets to take that away from my kids, right? Nobody should be taking that away from your kids either. But teachers are doing that right now, and they're doing that in Ohio too. I think that's what you're talking about. But John, I want to ask you, and I love so much that I get to put you on the spot right now, and I get to just ask you whatever I want. We didn't have a meeting before
it's so unusual.
This conversation.
For example, you don't do that every single week.
What I want to ask you right now, though, is, what do you say? We've talked a lot about the pressures kids are under, and specifically, like you said, kids don't want to be straight. Kids don't want to be cis. How do we talk to kids and parents and families who just want to get by? They just, they might not themselves be struggling with a gender identity or a mental health issue, but they don't want to make noise, right? No kid wants to be the kid in school that refuses to call another kid by the pronoun or by the name. No kid wants to be the kid in school that says, I don't believe that, I don't think that's right, I don't think that ally sticker is cool or good. How do we help those kids? Obviously, we know it's an emergency. We need to help the kids that are struggling mentally with the bigger issues. But how do we help those kids and families who are just trying to get by, but are increasingly being swept into this?
Yeah. Well, I think that's that's the key, is that you're increasingly being swept into it. One of the things that I really appreciate in Scripture is this idea of God's timeliness, that God is a God of time and place. And in Acts 17, Paul describes God as someone who determines the exact times in which we live in the boundaries of our dwelling place. And so, in other words, it's not just that we kind of live in a cultural moment and, we're supposed to skirt by, being obedient and going to church and all that, but actually we're called to a cultural moment. So I'm just not sure that that's going to be an option for everybody who wants it to be an option. I don't think that means we have to go fight every fight. We have to go make every cause ours. I don't think it's a Christian belief, to just go make noise because we can. I'm mindful of what Paul says is, as much as lies within you, live at peace with everyone. And I don't think we necessarily do a great job of that. But I do think that there are cultural moments in which, if you are going to fulfill the greatest commandment, the summation of the law, which is to love God, and then to love your neighbor as yourself, you're just going to get in trouble. And that's got to be okay with us. We've talked a lot over the last year about Alexander Solzhenitsyn's, I think has really good advice on this, where he was a Russian dissident who stood up against the communists, and the last thing that he wrote before being exiled from Russia was a piece called "Live Not by Lies," and he just said, "Look, you don't have to go protest at every protest. You don't have to be at every street corner. You don't have to hand out literature." But there are moments in where if you're not intentional, if you don't actually make the conscious decision, you will find yourself telling lies. You will find yourself going along with things that aren't true. So at least make that a commitment. I will not say something that's not true. I will not allow myself to say something that's not true. That goes to the question of naming, and pronoun usage. And that goes to the question of, caring for children who aren't really having a say, that this stuff is being, thrown at them from every, different direction. The other thing that I'll say too is, even if you aren't, you're committed, like I am not going to make a scene, like I am not going to cause problems. If you don't bring this conversation up with your own kids, then they will be brainwashed. I can't stress that enough. If you just, I would challenge you to do this just over the next week. Take a look and document every single thing that you see on social media, on billboards, a bumper sticker, a sign hanging in a store window, a commercial, and how many messages that you encounter over the next week that challenges children's understanding of who they are, either in terms of sexual behavior, sexual identity, or gender identity. Anybody else noticing that it's a lot louder than it used to be out there on all this front? Do you know what I'm saying? Okay. Culture is most dangerous not where it's the loudest. Culture is most dangerous where it just makes things seem normal. If you're not intentionally having this conversation about who your kids are, with your kids, about who they are, about what it means to be made in the image of God, about their bodies being good, about their bodies telling them something about God and about who they are, then they will believe things about their bodies, but it will not be what is true. It's not neutral out there. There is a direct, intentional attempt to convince from every aspect of culture. I mean, think about it, from education, from healthcare. Those are really powerful ones. Now throw in media, throw in business, good heavens, and you see the pressure in advancing a certain understanding about who we are as human beings, that your kids will believe that unless we intentionally counter that view. Does that make sense? So the intentionality, I think, just absolutely has to be there.
Can I piggyback on that real quickly? I was so glad John started tonight with kids aren't as resilient as we think they are. Just the experience every day in Christian schools. We have some of our folks here who are pouring into kids' lives. If you could see the crisis that they're in Christian schools with Christian families, it's a totally different day than when the rest of us were raised, right? The rest of us were raised in a time when Christendom, maybe not Christianity, but Christendom was the primary foundation of our lives, and we grew up with two-parent households in general. We grew up with man and woman being married. We grew up with the Puritan work ethic. We grew up with all these things, and this generation has been born outside of those things, and it's killing them. It's killing them emotionally and physically and spiritually and mentally. They're not resilient. They're struggling, dying literally sometimes, but certainly at the soul level. And the cultural onslaught is strong. It's huge, even for us, Christian schools, Christian families, Christian churches, dealing with kids in crisis every day in almost every family. I will add one thing that you said in the past that I've heard you said I've appreciated so much about your last comment. I will get it wrong so you can straighten it out. Confidence in Christianity or convictions in Christianity tend to be a loss without the courage of our Christianity. Right? If we have confidence in our faith and convictions in our faith, but we don't have courage in our faith, we're at a loss. And I thought that was profoundly true, John, for our day.
If I said that, it sounds brilliant, but no. But there's something there that's really actually important, because there was a level at which parents could rely on other voices in culture to say the same thing, even if it didn't use actual words. Just the way things were embodied, whether in commercials and just messaging. And you just cannot assume that you have an ally anymore, which is why right now, too, if you represent church leadership, parents desperately need you to be with them. You know what I mean? I know that churches often get a bad rap and all that. right now, the institution of the church, it is essential that the church stands with parents, because parents have all the other institutions that used to at least be roughly on their side, just aren't anymore. And we need churches not to sit this one out too.
AB, I want to ask you about this. Sorry, I call him AB. Speaking about that, I think we grew up in a time, at least my not fully formed idea of education in particular, but also other institutions, was that it's not the state's place, or it's not our place to tell the state that you should be invoking Christianity, right? You should be teaching Christianity to kids, or you should be giving Christians this sort of privilege in the public sphere. Part of it was probably because we were kind of used to, that was the way society was structured, at least in the West for a while. That's increasingly not the case, so it's becoming more obvious to us. But talk to me philosophically, does the state have a role in speaking into, for example, what kids hear in school, and even in state-sponsored schools? Does the state have a role, and what should that role be?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things there to unpack. First, just a baseline misconception, and actually, I wouldn't even say it's a misconception. It's a intentional messaging tool that's been used for years to get Christians to silence their voice in the political conversation, in the public policy conversation, right? And that's that, you have to keep your faith out of politics. You got to keep your faith out of government, right? Which sounds really like wise. Yeah, of course. Yeah, we of course we got it. The kids are going to be fine, right? It's one of those types of statements. Like, the most important thing is for parents to be happy. We got to keep our faith out of government. And really, though, at the end of the day, that doesn't make any sense when you understand that every law has a moral statement behind it, right? You shouldn't speed because it's dangerous, because it's wrong for you to run someone off the road and kill them, right? You shouldn't kill someone, you shouldn't steal, that's wrong. All of those things have ought to statements behind them and imply some type of moral objectivity that we agree that we shouldn't do this, right? And so, obviously, it is 100% okay for our faith to inform that moral foundation by which we're making our laws. And as Christians, from a constitutional perspective, however you decide to exercise your vote, however you decide to exercise the steward the responsibility you have as an American citizen, if you decide that based off of a still small voice in your head that you call your conscience, or you call that conscience Jiminy Cricket, or you call that conscience the Holy Spirit, it's all valid in the eyes of the law, right? So don't let someone try to use that line to bully you into silence, or to not allowing your faith to inform your position on certain societal issues. But the bigger concept here goes back to actually something John started off with of ideas have consequences. And I think especially when you look at how the state is formed and what's happening through government today, you see the downstream effect of bad sexual revolution ideology impacting public policy and having devastating impacts on real lives. Right? Government impacts real lives. That's why we call it our ministry at CCV, to be engaged there and to bring voice there. Let's look at there's the real obvious ways that we've talked about already, right? We've talked about things like we have judicial precedent in Ohio that a kid can be taken from parents' custody if the parents don't consent to gender ideology, right? We have that going on. We have going on in Ohio right now, a court has blocked our heartbeat bill. So by law, it is legal to murder unborn babies in the womb, right? These are downstream impacts of the sexual revolution that we really understand and see having devastating impacts on kids. But there's a bigger issue that's actually impacting way more kids than transgenderism or even abortion, right, of the sexual revolution that's hurting kids. And that is on poverty and kids, especially the kids that live around this church, that live in this community right now. The kids that are being born without moms and dads in their households, right? The kids that are being born in family structures that aren't there to support them and help them make sure they get to school, right? And help them make good decisions and help them get into those extracurriculars that we value so much. Our public policy has replaced the family with the state. right? And so we have welfare programs in Ohio that actually disincentivize moms from marrying their dads because their welfare benefits will be cut if they have two family incomes, right? So we're incentivizing children being raised without the commitment of a mom and a dad. And it's no coincidence then that we then see skyrocketing crime rates in cities like Columbus. I mean, just last week, a teenage girl was killed down at Franklin Park. It was the 8th kid that was shot at a park this year because she got into a fight with some other teenagers, right? We have record high drug use and overdose in Ohio right now. And you can't disconnect all of this from the broken down family and from a sexual revolution that said moms and dads don't matter, that it's better off for kids to be raised with a happy parent than not together, that told, you talk to people who work in pregnancy centers. Maria, you worked at Stowe Pregnancy Center, and people that are working with especially low income folks. And if they're not having sex regularly, they're not a valuable person, right? Not practicing abstinence is not an option in their mind. And we don't see these folks, we don't hear this, but this is the devastation that the sexual revolution and policies that have flowed out from it has wrought amongst, especially on those low income in our community. So it's wide ranging the way these ideas flow into culture and then flow into policy, and over generations start wreaking havoc.
Thanks. I can remember one woman in particular that I met with regularly at the pregnancy center who came in, was already pregnant and was concerned that she had become pregnant with a second child. She was really unfamiliar with how that all works anatomically, and we were walking through that. And one of the things I told her was, you don't have to continue in this sort of relationship with your boyfriend if you're not comfortable, if you're scared, or if you don't want to. And she said, if I don't have sex with him, where will I live? And I was like, I don't know where to start with that, but that, again, it's the water people are swimming in, is this post-sexual revolution water. But I want to get back to something that you said, and I want to ask Todd about how Tree kind of approaches this as a Christian school. And I know you're on the board of the Association of Christian Schools as well, which is an international organization, is that right? So how do you navigate, because in some ways you're coming alongside parents, right, as they attempt to disciple and educate their kids. And families who are sending their kids to Tree have already made a intentional choice about who Tree is and where they want their kids to go. How do you and the teachers at Tree navigate that relationship without stepping in between the parents and the kid, but coming alongside them? What does that look like practically?
Yeah, we've thought about just making a tagline for the future, and I think not just Tree of Life, but there are other Christian schools here tonight too. If we could just say for the future going forward, we exist to partner with parents, because the rest of the culture seems to be hiding things from parents, right, and keeping things from parents. So we might just use a line that says, we are here to partner with parents as you form your children, as you train up your children to follow Jesus. We want to do that with you. We're not going to step in between you and your child unless there's an unhealthy situation before Christ. But the difference is the equipping of the Holy Spirit, isn't it? Aren't we all in that same boat? The difference is the equipping of the Holy Spirit, listening for Him in the day-to-day, in the lives of kids, with parents, the Spirit of God coming alongside of us as we come alongside kids with their parents, working together for their health, for a healthier family, for a stronger family unit sometimes. But children are in crisis. Christian kids are in crisis. Unbelieving families' kids are in crisis because the culture is a mess, and it has an influence on all of us. So our privilege is to partner with parents for the good of their children and for the glory of God. And that didn't used to be a distinctive, but it's a radical distinctive. Even in the last couple of years, I don't know how it got here so quickly that we just disregarded parents as a society in schools. But for Christian schools, it's the first sentence of our mission statement. And it says, in partnership with the family. That's why we exist.
I just want to build off something about this, and I always have to apologize because a lot of times we get into this conversation, and you're exposed. You do this work, you get exposed to so much crazy stuff happening that you just want to make sure you guys got to. It's unbelievable, but at the same time, when things get the darkest is when the church shines the brightest. Amen? And what Todd just explained is one of the most beautiful opportunities for the church in America today to shine like we've never shined before, right? To offer something so unique, so special, if we would only think about it this way. I remember this in 2016 when I heard people talk about, Christians would talk about all the time, if Hillary Clinton wins, America's going to be over, it's going to be the worst thing ever. And I want to say, yeah, listen, I think she would bring some really bad policies. We're living them in many ways right now. But despair is not a word the Christ follower knows, right? We don't get permission to despair, right? And actually, a lot of times when things get really bad, it's a great opportunity for us to do something big, right? It's why we're working with Tree, and we just opened our first Christian school in a church off in the hilltop, right? 30 kids we snatched out of the hand of the devil and are attending a church, just a normal Memorial Baptist church, 250 person church that has now opened up their Sunday school classrooms for kids to go to school full-time 5 days a week at no cost. And this is the first that's become the model for hundreds of churches, schools in churches all over the state and eventually all over the nation. And this is the type of thing of, hey, church, when you're looking around and seeing all this darkness, this is a huge opportunity for you to do something special and big and take the hill, right? That this is our moment.
Yeah, that's awesome. It looks like we have a question over here. Did you want to ask something? You can step up to the microphone right here so we can hear you a little better.
So this is going to take two breaths because you brought up my name.
I'll allow it.
So, Bryce Curfeys with Upper Arlington. And it wasn't the high school, and I'm bringing this up because it was our elementary schools. We spent $200 million, and they surprised us and opened our new elementary schools with unisex signs. And when we pushed back on the administration and the school board, the level of arrogance was awesome because they're our kids, our tax money, and they said, tough. And it was this incredible battle. So anyway, they focused on our kids. They targeted our kids. My question is this. What do you say to the parents that say, to your point of shining in the culture, what do you say to them when they say we should be light and salt in the public school and not run to a Christian private school?
Yeah, I'll tackle that. I think that the idea of widely available education was a Christian idea. It is a uniquely Christian idea in the history of the world. Wherever Christianity went, education went. And education was seen as something that was available to all, not just to Christians. It was seen as, and it's reflective, right, of a bunch of things that are Christian assumptions about the world. First of all, that God has made himself known in his world, and he's made us with the ability to know. That's very different than if you have an atheistic framework of the world in which you think the universe itself is meaningless and purposeless. It's hard to get a solid grounding for education. Or if you think kids are the property of the state and just kind of cogs in the political or the military machine, then there's no real sense of what you want kids to actually learn, right? And so you see in oppressive governments around the world what their education looks like. So the idea of widespread, widely available, not just a Christian education, not just a Christian's education for the purpose of helping people become better people, better image bearers. That's a distinctly Christian idea in the history of the world. Without it, you don't get it. And that influenced the foundation of public education. But this is one of those things that requires us to distinguish between structure and direction. Something can be structurally good and directionally bad, right? So, in other words, leadership is something that is structurally good. Dictatorship is a way of taking something that is structurally good and making it directionally bad. Does that make sense? Sex is good. Homosex is a misdirection of that, or any of the other adjectives we could put on the front side of it. So the question has to do with how then is widely available education being pulled off today? And I think we can look at it and say, well, it's no longer something that supports its original purpose. It actually is something that teaches ideas that teach kids that there is no God, that they are the center of reality, that there are actually no givens in the world, including used to be no moral givens, and now there's no givens to their bodies or to anything else that's observably normal. So now we got to look at something and say, this has directionally gone so bad is it even the same thing anymore? And I think that's a big question. The other thing, though, is then that response of what about being salt and light? What about being missionaries? I don't know that we would send a 6-year-old to go be a missionary in a war-torn country. But we send them every day somehow to be a missionary in the middle of a war for their hearts and minds and for the hearts and minds of their peers. It just doesn't seem like a wise decision. It seems to violate the idea of prudence. Where I've kind of landed on this personally is I want as many Christians as possible that can influence the leadership of public educational systems, that can be in the classroom, that can be creative. I remember years ago just being so inspired meeting a woman who taught honors English, which at the time was the hotbed of Post-Modernism at the university and at upper tier high schools. And she had figured out how to teach comparative worldview and point people to C.S. Lewis and ultimately to Christ and honors English at a public school in Nashville. And I thought, yeah, that's the way it can be done, because all truth is God's truth and Christianity has the best ideas about the world, so let's go at it. Sending a teacher to be a missionary in a public school. And I think, by the way, if you're a teacher at a Christian school, a teacher at a public school, or a teacher at a home school, you're an educational missionary, right? I mean, you're just supposed to be. Thank you. It's a little awkward, but yeah, every Christian's supposed to be on mission, right? But I just don't know that it's wise to send your kids into the middle of that sort of thing if you can help it. Now, let me just say something really clear. I get in trouble sometimes for my breakpoint commentaries. I know that's hard to believe. And one of the times you get is when you wrestle with this issue, because there are those who are like, man, every parent should take their kid out of public school immediately. It's not always possible. And we need, one of the brightest spots, when you talk about the hope and doing the big things and so on that Aaron just talked about, one of the brightest spots right now in the Christian world, around the world, but including here, is the educational innovation that's been done by Christians to make more opportunities available to more people. And the founding of Christian education, at least the most recent chapter of the founding of Christian schools in America, wasn't one that was economically available to everybody. It wasn't one that was situationally or even culturally available. In some situations, there were, I think, other sins of classism and racism that were actually involved in it. Homeschooling wasn't available to everyone. Today, it is available to more people in more social situations than ever before. One of the leaders of that has been Aaron in the state of Ohio. I mean, it is a remarkable thing here that everybody else is looking to Ohio going, oh, we can do that. We can actually make Christian education available, accessible, and affordable. If we see a group of children being victimized by bad ideas, and our job is to protect and help them, like, by the way, every generation of Christ followers that I can see throughout history, in the collision with their cultural moment, they have found themselves protecting children. It's like a common recurring theme in the history of Christianity. So if we believe that our chapter in that story today is to help and protect children, it is to maybe rescue children out of that situation by making it more available for them to take advantage of other opportunities. I'm glad that it's happening more today than ever before. So you see where I'm coming down. First of all, I think to say that we should send 6-year-olds or 8-year-olds or most 12-year-olds, if we haven't formed them for that sort of battle, then what are we doing sending them into that sort of battle? That's just patently foolish and unwise, right? That's folly. On the other hand, if we're going to turn around and say, every parent should bring their kids out, we got to do stuff to make that actually possible and available. And both of those things can be true at the same time, I think.
I'll just add one short thought to that if I can. One of the career professions that sends more kids to Christian schools than any other in the United States is public school teachers. We should probably tell ourselves something. And the other thing that I'll tell you about that is I get to serve as a pastor in a church here in Columbus as well, and nearly every week, public school teachers come to me and say, hey, you lead in a Christian school, right? And you're a pastor at our church. Can you help me figure out how to do ministry in the public school because I'm really struggling with, and then they list the expectations that are being placed on them in our society to call boys girls and girls boys and all the other things that they're struggling. Help me, Pastor, help me figure out how to do this. I don't want to get fired. I don't want to lose my job. I know I'm fulfilling my calling, but how do I do this in a way that doesn't compromise my faith in Jesus? And if adults are struggling with that, imagine a 9-year-old.
To make it a little simpler too, I think these things are connected, but it's not just that public schools and the system in general is indoctrinating with these ideologies. Because of those ideologies, in large part, they're also abdicating the original duty. And I worked on a commentary with John a couple months ago and was looking up some of these studies and stats. And I don't remember the exact number, but it was not insignificant. It was something like 24% of high school graduates in the United States, so kids who graduated high school, were given a degree, can't read. And I don't mean like can't pass reading comprehension. I mean are actually illiterate. So the schools are not only doing the indoctrination and the sort of dangerous ideological stuff, but they're also it's just reached an emergency level. They're not teaching kids to read or to do math. And part of that is because of the ideas that they're propagating. I mean, the critical theory mood has led to, in some states like California, you can't teach that math has a correct answer because that's rooted in, racial supremacy or whatever it might be. I mean, when you start with an idea as strange and radical and irrational as a boy can be a girl, then why can't 2 + 2 = 5? And that's what we're seeing play out. So it's just reached that emergency level. But Aaron, can you?
Just real quick,
Yeah.
just to run that home. 85% of kids in Columbus Public School can't pass the 3rd grade reading guarantee. 85% of 3rd graders in Columbus can't read. This is the largest school district in the state of Ohio. They're not a bug, they're a feature of inner city education today across America. Think about what that means a generation from now. We don't know what COVID has done, COVID school closures have done, and then you throw in all the rest of what's happening with children today. And talk about a crisis for the church to respond to. It is a scale that we can't wrap our minds around. And let me tell you, if somebody comes to you with a solution for this problem that is going to be solved in one election or in the next few years, then I've got some beachfront property down in German Village I want to sell you. Like, this is a generational crisis for us that's going to take the entire church and all that we have to fix. It is doable. It's really doable. And it's really exciting when you get to see a kid have their life changed because of the church. But it's massive.
And can I just say, too, that if anybody comes to you with a solution that is just focused on the school itself and doesn't involve the fact of getting more dads in the lives of more kids, then I've got other beachfront property in Cleveland. Oh, wait, there is a beach up there.
There's a beach.
Ohio, geez. But you know what I mean. In other words, this is not just the failure of young people right now is not just a failure of the public schools. The public schools are inadequate to address a brokenness that precedes it at the level of fatherlessness that we have. And and that's also another great opportunity for the church.
So just a quick warning on that, though. When dads get involved and when you send your kids to good schools, you end up with the situation at my house last night, which is my husband trying to help my 1st grader with her math, and I hear him in the other room going, I don't understand what they're asking you to do.
Common Core, man. I don't get it.
I think we have another question, though.
Yes. First, thanks for being here. I'm a father of a daughter. She's almost 2. And most likely, she's either going to be homeschooled or she's going to go to Tree for Life. And I believe, all right, I believe the teachers have the biggest impact. So, thank you for your work, Dr. Mara. But the teachers have the most impact, and there's a very good chance you might get a bad one. So, legalistically, how do you navigate the hiring process when it comes to like non-discriminatory hiring practices? How do you get good teachers and not the bad ones?
That's a great question. I know the answer is not adequate to say by God's grace, but it's true. I will say this, that we had a pastor come some years ago to our school, and he talked about the importance. He had his kids in our school because he wanted to surround his kids with what he called other qualified adults. I love that phrase. I've stolen it ever since. So we need to surround our young children with other qualified adults who are teaching them the same things that we are and coming alongside the same way we are. And of course, I can include Christian school teachers as well. The honest answer to that is found in the scripture. The scripture says that the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few. And then it says, so ask the Lord of the harvest to send his workers into his field. Into his fields. And so that's what we do. I think I can speak on behalf of all the Christian schools here. We are asking the Lord of the harvest to send his excellent workers, his teachers, his qualified teachers into his field because they're his children. And we have watched him supernaturally answer for Tree of Life year after year after year, including this one. In this hiring environment, we all know what it's like to hire right now. I think it was 33 staff members joined us this year, and their qualifications blow my mind. And their ability to love kids into loving Jesus can only be explained by Jesus sent them.
I just want to jump on this real quick because there's a bunch to unpack with this question. And because I know some folks that will say, I had my kid going to a private school, a Christian school, a Catholic school, and they went woke. We saw this stuff show up there, and look how terrible it's gone. And there's a few different things here to point out. First and foremost, and actually sometimes I'll have this conversation in light of the backpack bill, and I'm going to tell you about the backpack bill before we go. It's a universal school choice bill. And sometimes what these folks will do, what some good conservative friends will say is, schools that take voucher dollars have gone woke, and it's been so terrible, and so this is why we shouldn't have voucher programs, and it's the government's attempt to take over private schools. And
they're not racially diverse either.
Exactly,
What
right?
the one accusation is, wow.
So they'll say these things, and the reality is, the private schools that have gone woke have done so because they stopped hiring people that agree with their doctrine, right? Catholic schools stopped hiring Catholics. Right? They wanted to have the best football program, so they hired the best coach, regardless of whether they were somebody who was going to form children in their Catholic doctrine. They wanted to hire the best literature or science teacher, right? And so they stopped hiring the best. They started hiring the most academically, accredited person, and stopped hiring the person with the worldview that aligns with theirs, right? We need our Christian institutions to be more Christian, not less. Right? We need to be reaffirming these types of things. The other thing, though, that is a real crisis at hand right now is higher ed, right? And what's happened in academia, right? And this is the biggest problem. To John's point about a critical theory mood, a lot of times you'll hear teachers unions folks or public schools folks or the media saying critical race theory is not being taught in schools. And in one sense, they're right. That you don't have somebody standing up in front of the room and say, let me teach you about Marcuse, let me teach you about Kimberly Crenshaw, let me teach you about this legal theory of critical race theory. That is correct. They're not standing up in second graders and teaching them that. But the reality is the worldview that higher ed education departments are teaching the next generation teachers are through a critical theory lens. Critical theory is a worldview. It's the lens by which you understand and interpret the world. The way that higher ed is being taught today is through a critical theory lens. So teachers are being taught to teach through a critical theory lens. They are fish that don't know they're wet, right? They're teaching critical theory, not intentionally. And this is even our Christians that are going through the mainstream of higher academia. And mind you, this is where I bring everything back to public policy. This is your tax dollars funding a state university system to produce teachers that are teaching this. And it's why we need to start questioning, why are we sending $2.2 billion every year in our state, every 2 years in our state biennial budget to universities that are teaching this? As an aside, this is my public statement to the Ohio State University and all of our good universities here, as I look in the camera, that in next year's budget, we're coming for you. And we're going to do everything we can to ensure that our dollars aren't being used to indoctrinate the next generation.
Thanks. I think we have another question over here.
First of all, thank you for clarifying that about the missionary concept with children, because I think that is a big, often discussed topic. And also I appreciate the fact that, you're looking at teachers who can do that sort of thing. But I would like to ask you about another, this is kind of a tricky way of making a statement by asking a question, right? But, we have school boards, and people can run for school boards. Anybody can run for school boards. And these people have very powerful decision-making abilities. Of course, they are up against the unions and all kinds of other things, but there are ways, how can we encourage Christians to consider becoming missionaries, you might call it that way, by running for school boards? I mean, these are not fun jobs. But it is a way, I think, that, we can really impact the culture. And if you're talking about saving kids, the majority of our kids are going to public schools. So is there some, how can we motivate committed Christians to get involved?
Yeah, thanks. Aaron?
Yeah, John, do you have something?
No, run for the school.
Yeah. No,
That was a statement in the form of a question, and it was the right one. So did everyone just listen to what she said and run for the school board?
No, 100%. Any elected office that's open, I can't tell you how many elected offices, appointments, gubernatorial appointments, positions that are open today that are just packed with, my word, Marxists, right? And the reason they're filled with Marxists is because nobody opposed them. Nobody ran, right? And so if you sit around and you're saying, why are things so bad? The answer is probably because you didn't do anything about it. I see, as I sit here, I see my friend, State Representative Adam Byrd from Claremont County, who's here. Adam was a superintendent, a public school superintendent in Claremont County. He did not need more controversy after being a superintendent of a public school district, and he decided to run for the State House. And now he is one of our champions at the State House for things like the SAFE Act, for things like the backpack bill, for things like the life of conception bill. And it's because he was faithful to the call that came his way. So thank you, Adam, for being here, and thank you for what you do. So yes, run for school board. But let me say one thing here about school boards. There are 611 school districts in the state. Let's say, on total, that each of them have at least 5 school board members, right? They actually have, most of them have more, but let's say about 5, right? So that's 30,000 school districts in the state. Sometime when we're talking about things like the backpack bill and universal school choice, I will have folks push back on me and say, well, we really just need to go after the school boards. I will tell you, we do not have enough money in this room to combat what the NEA spends on school board seats every day. Right, in a systematic way. We care about, at CCV, we try to deal with the systematic problems. There's individual problems where we've seen, especially here locally, people run for school boards and make a tremendous difference, and that's amazing, and we need to keep seeing that. But when we're talking about a systematic change, we need to say, what can we do to change the situation as quickly as possible? A strategy of going after the school boards is incredibly difficult. But now let's say we do actually successfully run a campaign to replace all 30,000 school seats, or at least a majority, let's say 3/5 of that, so we have a majority of the state school, of all the school boards across the state, and we take over those school boards. Will that stop critical theory and gender theory from being taught in the schools? No. Because we still have a school system that is chock full of teachers who think that the way you teach is through a critical theory lens. I ask this to lawmakers all the time when we're talking about issues in the classroom, and they're trying to come up with a way to not do the backpack bill. I'll ask, who is the second grade teacher at this elementary school in Warren, Ohio. Who's the second grade teacher there? I don't know. I said, so how are you going to stop them from teaching something that you don't like? The reality is, the only enforcement mechanism we have to actually change this is empowering parents. And until a parent can say, I don't like what you're teaching my kid, and because of a thing like the backpack bill, I can actually choose to send my kid to a different school. And if you don't stop teaching this garbage, I'm taking my kid out, and guess what? The money's coming with them. And by the way, I'm telling all their friends, and by the way, the church down the street has opened a school, so I can actually send them there. Until we have that system, all of these problems we're seeing in the public education system are not going to stop. We need an all-of-the-above approach. We got to run for school board. We got to get a lot of this curriculum out of the public schools. But it has to start with backpack, and it has to start with the church getting serious about discipling the next generation.
Another question over here?
Maybe just to follow up on the previous question, clearly we're under attack, and thank you all for making a stand for Jesus in our kids' lives and those that are most impacted. Where else can we get involved? What are the needs, and how can we help?
Great question. John?
Well, I think Aaron's comment there about all of the above is really important. I think a lot of times we look at how big and pressing something is, and we don't do what we can do, which is right outside of our own door, which is the opportunity right in front of us. And I think that a faith that is personal but not privatized is a faith that can really move the needle. When everyday Christians are taking seriously their own calling. I think right now, for example, for example, pregnancy resource centers in certain states are under incredible attack by state officials. In California, they're actively investigating pregnancy resource centers for malpractice without any cause, with the attempt to shut them down. The state has issued a consumer fraud alert warning that was authored by NARAL, of all people. Again, it's just bizarre. So how do we help them? Up until now, Christians have said, I got to go fold diapers, and I'm going to go contribute, and I'm going to, maybe help go to their banquet and give them some money, and all that's really, really good. What we really need right now is well-respected business leaders in California who stand up and lend their credibility to these pregnancy resource centers as centers of hope. Does that make sense? And that, I'm going to vouch for them. And it's going to come at a social cost and a public cost. And right now, there's probably not enough Christians that are willing to do that when it comes to that sort of cost. I think part of that, too, is that Christians need to develop what I've been calling a theology of getting fired. We stay in there and we're not jerks. We don't want to just rant and rave, but, it may be that we've got to take a shot because it's the right thing to do. And, that's not something that we often hear from a pulpit here and there, or from very many places, but I think it's going to be a part of it.
I'll just add this. I know we have another question. All of us are called to do ministry. We all work for the glory of God. But those who do full-time ministry are absolutely in need of marketplace wisdom and counsel and work. So just to hear from one who does ministry for a living that those in the marketplace, just like John was just saying, are so valuable, and your wisdom and insights are so necessary. The kingdom of God is supposed to be us working together. And for us to thrive going forward, we're going to have to figure out how to work together more closely for his glory, because the attack is a coordinated attack, and the response has to be a coordinated response in the kingdom of God.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, I think we have one more question. We're going to make this the last one of the night. Go ahead.
First, I was going to reaffirm what you guys have said about teachers not knowing that they're wet. 10 years ago, when I was at Ohio State in the education program, I had professors who would just straight out say, if you're a kindergarten teacher and you aren't teaching the Two Mommies book, you should not be a teacher, get out of the program. And everyone else in my class nodding their head in agreement. So to that end, talking about how fast things are changing and how quickly they're changing, and trying to look ahead at what's next. In the next 3 years, 10 years, what are the trends that you're seeing? What we're looking at, if things don't change?
culturally. John, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, making predictions is, I think it was Yogi Berra that says making predictions is dangerous, especially predictions about the future. And I'm a non-profit, get it? I lead a knife.
Boo.
A couple things. First of all, other relational arrangements will be included into the definition of family and marriage. That's inevitable, and it will be disastrous. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think you're going to start to see an incredible amount of backlash against the transgender ideology. And that's going to be good news, but it's going to be brutal. And in other words, the thing we have to remember is even as culture runs off, culture is not the real world. Culture is what humans make of the real world. So it's either in alignment with reality or it can be against reality, just like, in some societies where culturally it was normal instead of to irrigate, to do a rain dance, right? It didn't work. And there were consequences of that really bad way of doing culture as opposed to just irrigating. Does that make sense? The same thing's true. You're either going with the grain of the universe or against the grain of the universe. And this is something that we, at least on the gender issue, that every Christian and every parent needs to know. America right now is quickly becoming an outlier in the sense that we're doubling down on this really bad way of thinking about gender and sexuality and the human body. And the rest of the world is pulling the brakes. Yeah, there is a lot of, particularly when it comes to the intervention for children, there is a lot of trans regret that's happening. It's a popular Twitter feed where 20-something-year-old, primarily young women, who were convinced that they were born into the wrong body and they were actually boys, have caused permanent damage to themselves. And their stories are actively being silenced, but there's so many of them that it's getting more and more difficult. And we're not listening in terms of America, but the rest of the world largely is. And I think it'll catch up to us. And so I think that's something, too, that we can expect. The other thing, too, that we're just really seeing is, in addition to these the moral craziness that we've really focused in on tonight, we're really beginning to see a vacuum of meaning across culture, a catastrophic loss of meaning and purpose that has affected almost everything. So when Todd mentioned earlier that, we're seeing, kids actually being harmed, it's not just that kids are being harmed and they're being mentally abused by not giving them any sense of a reference point that they can tether onto. And so they're just getting beat up by the world. We've seen the suicidal ideation rate after COVID. All of this, by the way, was spiking before COVID, and it's culture-wide. So as an anecdote, 2019, the year before COVID, was the third straight year that the life expectancy of the average American male, went down. Three straight years, 17, 18, 19. The last time that had happened was during World War I and the Spanish flu. So in other words, beginning of the 20th century, that was before ambulatory services, access to hospitals, our understanding of viruses and immunity and treatment and infection. So what on earth could possibly explain that we had 3 straight years, COVID's not even a factor, that the average life expectancy of the American male goes down? And it has nothing to do with physical conditions. It was all emotional and mental conditions. You tell people they're the center of reality, then people are like, so what's the point? And eventually that stuff bears fruit. And I think we're going to continue to see a catastrophic loss of meaning play out in people's lives, which of course is another wonderful opportunity for the gospel and for the Christians to be Christians, or in Chuck's word, for the church to be the church. But man, it's going to be brutal. Along with that loss of meaning comes a loss of trust. You guys see 3 stories this week. Big cheating scandals in chess. Did you guys see this? In chess and poker and in fishing.
And there was one in Irish dancing.
And in Irish, really?
Yes.
You need to send that to Casey because we were talking about that. So it's just bizarre, but it has to do with also this loss of trust, you know. And I think we're going to see that chaos. And to Aaron's point, these are incredible opportunities, you know. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, right? So in the land where everyone is completely lost, if you can just point to the North Star, it's you can have a profound impact. So I see it as a great opportunity for hope, but I do think there's some further unraveling to be done. Does that get at what you're asking?
I know you want to wrap it up, but I'll add just in a positive way, the way you ended it positively, John. I couldn't agree more. Our lead pastor likes to say, we can either lament over all that's been lost in our culture, and there is much to lament over, or we can lament over the lost and go get them. And the people around us are dying without Jesus, and Jesus is the hope, and we have the answer. And there don't appear to be any other answers. And so we're down to one, praise God. And so I do think there's this incredible momentum opportunity in the body of Christ to come together by the Holy Spirit and to make a significant difference while the culture unravels. The gates of hell are defensive, right? And so this is an opportunity for us to step in with courage and willing to pay a price, I think, and to take the ground God has designed us to take with grace and truth, and to stand firmly and watch the Lord do what only he can do as a culture collapses. I do think, I'm not a prophet either. I work in a nonprofit. I like that line. I'm going to steal that. But I do think there's a historic kingdom opportunity for the body of Christ to come together as the culture collapses. And I do believe that's what he's doing.
The one thing that really jumped out to me, Mike, with your question, that I still don't think we've fully have sort of reconciled with, but over the next few years, but especially over the next 5, 10, 15 years, the impact of our educational failings on children and our school closures on children, and especially impoverished children. We have built systems right now in America so that the least among us, the most impoverished among us, a lot of us don't have to see, right? People can't imagine it when I tell them at the State House, and our big, beautiful, historic State House that Abraham Lincoln came through 3 times, and it's just a special building, that just less than 3 miles away are kids being raised with dirt floors, right? The number of kids through COVID in Columbus City School, we had a 74% chronic absentee rate in Columbus City during COVID. The drug numbers, the violence numbers, the family breakdown numbers, the jobless numbers, these are serious issues. And they're not something that's solved with, passing a good bill or a good election or anything like that. This is going to be a generational fallout. And it's something that the church needs to be. It's something that I've loved when I've seen some great stuff out of the Colson Center on the dignity of work, and we have a lot of culture building to do as a church, far beyond just talking about a biblical sexual ethic. It's talking about what it means to be human in so many different ways, and so for us as a church, there's massive challenges, I think bigger than a lot of us even realize, but also, as we said, big opportunities, because we serve a big God who tends to, when I look through Scripture, likes to really show off when it's clear it's only him, right?
I think that's absolutely true about God. He is the one and only God, and he, if you think of the birth of Jesus it's a virgin birth. That is the calling card of a God who is hungry for glory, and is hungry for glory because he knows that our highest joy is found in glorifying him, I think. But I think, John, I've heard you say that before about in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And I think we're in that moment. That's a gift for the church, because it would be one thing if our call right now was to convince our culture of some really difficult calculus. But if all we have to say is God made the world and it's real and it's good and physical, like our physical bodies are real things that are good. It's good to be a woman and it's good to be a man. And that kids' needs should be put above the desires of adults. If those are the two things we can continuously say, I think that we will make we will do the culture building that you're talking about. I want to turn it over to you to pray for us, but before we do, will you guys just join me in thanking these guys for being here tonight? Thank you.
Especially, we're going to get you out of here with three quick things, and I want to tie actually to the question we got earlier about what can we do. At Center for Christian Virtue, this is the question we spend thinking all day about. You know, God has blessed us. It's special having John here because it was 4 years ago John came out for a gala for us with Jim Daly. And since that time, and it was really because of John's speech really lit the night up. But CCV has about tripled in size, and God's allowed us to do some amazing things. But we always say we can't hire enough people to deal with the issues. We have to empower people like you to have a voice and be an impact where you are. And so we do that a wide variety of ways. If we could put the first slide up. The first is that I want to talk to you about is we have an election coming up. And actually today, if you're not registered to vote, you have about 2 hours and 50 minutes to still register to vote in time for the upcoming election. And if you've moved in the last 2 years, you need to update your voter registration. You can go to that website right there, buckeyeballot.com, and you can update your voter registration. I tell you about how important this is because, my friends, everything we just talked about, there is a public policy that's impacted it, and there are candidates that are diametrically opposed to each other that are running for election to represent you. At CCV, we're a nonpartisan organization. We don't serve the elephant or the donkey. We serve the Lamb of God, as a Southern Baptist friend of mine likes to say. And so we want to help you just be informed. So we put together this voter guide. You'll see these when you walk out. This is a free, nonpartisan voter guide. We survey every candidate on the ballot and report back to you where they stand. If they don't answer our survey, we research their public statements, their websites, their position statements, and report to you where they stand on these issues. So you can cut through all the political spin and actually find out. This is a free resource for you, but also this is a free resource that your church can give out. We have hundreds of churches all over the state that give out these resources. You can also go to buckeyeballot.com. If you don't know who your state representative is or your state legislative district or state senate district, you can go there, enter your address, and get a voter guide with just the candidates on your ballot. You can also see who's endorsed those candidates, find out their website. This is a real act of love that the team puts together for you, and we have bulletin inserts, voter guides that your church can give out to. This is one of the few election resources that churches can give out that is 501c3 safe. So I want to encourage you to get that. I do also want to point out to you, when you get this voter guide, don't just stop at the U.S. Senate race and look at the candidates that are running for Senate, but go to page 6 and 7 and look at the state Supreme Court. And I will just say, as I mentioned, Ohio's heartbeat bill is currently blocked right now because a Hamilton County Court judge blocked it. As we speak right now, we overturned Roe v. Wade in federal law, right? So there's no longer a right to abortion under federal law. Planned Parenthood and the ACLU sued to create a right to abortion under Ohio law. So they're trying to create an Ohio Roe v. Wade right now. And if a pro-abortion candidate wins one of the 3 state Supreme Court seats that are open right now, Ohio will have our own Roe v. Wade. So that's on the ballot when you go vote. So you need to know where the candidates stand on the issues for state Supreme Court in particular. And again, because they're judges, we can't ask, are you pro-life or pro-abortion? All we can ask is their judicial philosophy. So we can ask which U.S. Supreme Court justice best reflects your judicial ideology, and we report that back to you. Again, all of these, you'll see a stack of these free out there. Next slide, if you can. Real quick, Christmas season is coming up. How many of you guys like giving? How many like giving, right? How many of you like giving and it didn't cost you anything, right? Send those hands. There's a lot of you, right? Giving something that didn't cost you anything is an amazing thing. Those are the fun gifts to get to give. Well, because of a bill we just passed last year in last year's state budget, we created something called a tuition tax credit. And that allows you to make a donation of $750 per person, $1,500 per couple, to what's called a scholarship granting organization of up to, like I said, up to $750. And then you get back on your state income taxes $750. So you make a donation and you get all that money back that you made. So it's a donation that costs you absolutely nothing. And then all of the money that you donated, the money you gave, goes to that SGO, and then they use that to give kids scholarship to attend private schools. So CCV, we started an organization called the Ohio Christian Education Network that Troy McIntosh runs for us. We started an SGO, a scholarship granting organization, and Tree of Life is a member of that. So if you go to that link, tolcs.org/SGO, you can go tonight and make a $750 donation to Tree of Life, to the SGO, Tree of Life, through that link, and you will get back, when you file for your state income taxes, all of that money, and then Tree can use that money to help more of these kids get a godly and quality Christian education. Guys, this is a game changer for a school like Tree. Right? They are doing, I tell you, the teachers that they hire are amazing people. They get paid very little relative to what a lot of the public school teachers get paid. And this will help them pay those teachers more, help more students. And this costs you nothing. So if you can, go to that link right there. Last one we'll put up. And we're going to hand these to you as you walk out the door. Everything we just talked about, you heard us talk about the backpack bill. The backpack bill is legislation that would give make every child in Ohio eligible for a voucher to attend the school of their choice, right? If we want to save the public schools, we have to start by making them accountable, right? And the only way they are accountable is if parents can hold them accountable through legislation like the backpack bill, making every kid eligible. Arizona just passed this bill. It is doable. We've been working on this bill for over a year now at CCV. And I tell you, we have the votes at the State House to do this right now. But the teachers union, all 120,000 of them, are going to do everything they can to stop it. And so your lawmaker needs to hear from you that you support the backpack bill. When you walk out, you're going to be handed one of these postcards. And if you go to this link, backpackbill.com/action, you can find out who your state representative or your state senator is. And if you can, you'll see on the backside, write a little note, we want the backpack bill. Find their address on the website, put their name and address on it, and put a stamp on it, and mail it off tomorrow. You will have done. You ask, what could you do? This is a very easy thing you can do. And this is the type of thing that rocks their world. State lawmakers, everyone pays attention to Washington, but the reality is that the policies that actually impact you happen in Columbus. And when they hear from people like you, it rocks their world. So I ask you, as you walk out, grab one of these postcards, grab a voter guide, go to that website, backpackbill.com/action, and find out who your lawmaker is, and drop that backpack bill postcard in the mail to you. Representative Byrd.
It only takes about 3 emails to move my needle. It doesn't take much.
3 emails, you hear that? Like just those emails, those. I tell you guys, I'll also mention, real quick plug, November 10th, prayer at the State House. If you've never been down to the State House, come down with us. About 4 times a year, we gather in the State House in their atrium at 10 a.m. Ruth Edmonds? 10 a.m. at the State House. We'll gather together, pray for our lawmakers, pray for this bill, pray for the future of our nation. We hope you join us. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. You've been so gracious with your time. Join me in thanking, sure. Yes, Christian Assembly. And John Stonestreet, if you guys don't get Breakpoint, make sure you sign up for Breakpoint and download the podcast to listen to my amazing wife every day on Friday. But thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you out in the hallway.